There's an old saying in Vietnam, we've been weak and we've been strong, but we've never been short of heroes. In 1990, as Vietnam still struggles to make friends with the Western world, the heroes are coming from unexpected places.
A lot of us felt that we never finished. It chopped, and that was that. And we thought, if this is the problem, you know, we've just got to go up and see whether we can finish it now, if you like, or just maybe pick it up again.
Dennis Montgomery, engineer from Wellington, New Zealand, is on his way to help meet a desperate need in a country which, in terms of wealth, ranks third to last in the whole world. Quy Nhon Province Hospital, 1968. The war was exacting an awful toll on civilians. It was nothing like MASH or China Beach. It was worse. But Quy Nhon had some special friends: doctors, nurses, laboratory technologists, and engineers from New Zealand. Not from the army, just civilians, there to help. For more than 12 years, while the battle raged nearby, often in the streets outside, the New Zealand team saved lives and tended the civilian wounded.
It was quite common, well, it was the usual custom to have 2 or 3 patients to a bed.
Jim Mann, medical technologist. With Dennis Montgomery and other Kiwis, he's come back to Quy Nhon after more than 20 years.
They just lay on a straw mat on the bed, and so it was quite possible to put 2 at one end and 1 at the other, and so get them all into the wards. It's hard for anyone who hadn't been here to imagine the scene, really, and it was not uncommon to see rats in the wards running around.
"15 years after the end of the war, Quy Nhon, like so many other provincial towns in Vietnam, has a quaint picture postcard appearance that disguises severe poverty. In New Zealand or on Australia's Gold Coast, Quy Nhon's beachfront would be million-dollar real estate territory. But years of war, followed by a Cold War waged through economic sanctions, have left towns like Quy Nhon and their hospitals short of the most basic requirements. It's an unusual sight for Western eyes. She's in hospital, but the primitive level of care available means that her abdominal pain stays unrelieved. As does the agony of this man who's here with bladder stones. It was pain like this that last month brought some of the Kiwis back to Quy Nhon. Taking up where they left off in the 70s, Dennis Montgomery, child health specialist Dr. Margaret Neve, and Jim Mann have come back bearing gifts.
This is a heavy one, Tom.
Medical supplies, hundreds of kilos of supplies, scrounged from New Zealand hospitals. Syringes, close to expiry date, but still perfectly good. Medical books, sutures, a microscope, light bulbs for operating theatres. And with the old hands, Dr. Ian Campbell, a Wellington GP, who did the begging from hospital boards up and down the country. On a sweltering Saturday morning, months of work are about to pay off. A decade and a half after saying goodbye, the Kiwis are back.
Có rồi, she married. Có con không? She had 2 children.
For Dr. Margaret Neve, there'll be many reunions with people whose lives she saved. Vietnamese who were just youngsters in those war-torn days and now have children of their own, against all the odds.
Dreadful fingers out of the
Are some of those children here now?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, they are.
That, is that boy in the film?
Which is that boy now?
That's good. That's good.
That's her.
And in the photo here, she is near.
What was she treated for?
Oh, she
Nephritis.
nephritis.
The kidneys. And she's had,
Seriously ill, Margaret?
well, I can't remember, it's a long time. But nephritis is always serious. But if you've had 2 children since, it's a good test of cure.
So worthwhile.
Và đạt nhiều thành tích trong chuyến đi và hy vọng rằng là chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau trong những năm tới.
Once again, we would like to wish you good health and success in your trip, and we hope that in the future we will see you again.
For a hospital that exists on facilities that we'd have considered ancient in the 60s, this is a momentous day. It's more than just a few spares for the hospital generator and surgical equipment. It carries the promise of a lifeline from New Zealand to Vietnam. As they toured the wards that Saturday, everywhere was the evidence of poverty and need. From the bare wires that connect the operating theatre lights to the unreliable power source, to the one incubator that doesn't work anyway, to the sick and dying in the primitive intensive care unit. This is a place with major needs. And in a quiet corner of the Province Hospital, a little corner of New Zealand. A legacy to a Labour Prime Minister. A place that used to sum up the very best of our intentions. When they built these children's wards 20 years ago and put Sir Walter Nash's name on it, it was the fervent hope of the New Zealanders involved that this would be an island of excellence in the middle of third world difficulty. But when Frontline visited the children's wards here, we found scenes that were among the most distressing on our journey. A seasoned war correspondent once wrote, "The kids here are looked after in Crimean war conditions."
Very slow.
That was 22 years ago. But today, even though there are no more rockets, napalm or Agent Orange, the picture is still very bleak.
They don't have an ability to keep blood for a very long period of time. They can't make plasma, and they can't they make up some fluids like glucose and saline and things of that sort. They don't have any intravenous drug facilities at all. Like a child like that one with the meningitis should have an intravenous infusion running all the time.
What does it mean for that child's chances of survival?
Well, I would think the child's chances of survival without a damaged brain are pretty small.
I guess even with the equipment you managed to bring here, you must look around at scenes like this and think this is really just a drop in the ocean.
Yes. You know, it's only tears in the bucket, there's no question about that. The fact that you look at the hospital and it's unpainted and the floors are uncleaned and...
Obviously massive problems with cross-infection potentially in a place like this.
A place like this. It's primitive.
All a bit depressing.
It's very depressing.
Depressing or not, the Kiwis came back to help and to assess ways in which New Zealand might help at a broader level. When Dennis Montgomery has overhauled the hospital generators, the reality is that he has to return to Wellington. One ray of hope is that the Volunteer Service Abroad organisation is looking at sending skilled New Zealanders to work in and around Queen Yon, precisely because of our historic links with this place. People will make an enormous difference.
What they need is expertise to train them. There are plenty of hands here in Vietnam and they are plenty of intelligent people. So what they need is somebody to show them what to do. That, I think, is the biggest aid we can give.
It wasn't just the Province Hospital that benefited from the New Zealand mission. Across town, at the City Hospital, another van load of supplies from Christchurch, Tauranga and Wellington reached their destination. Some poignant moments here too. a former Viet Cong medic who used to send the occasional wounded soldier in from the jungle to the neutral Dr. Margaret Neve for no questions asked treatment, opens much needed surgical implements. A moment of sadness as the microscope Jim Mann packed so lovingly in New Zealand is unwrapped, revealing a base that's been shattered in transit. Is it repairable, Jim?
I wouldn't think so. It may be, but I'm not sure.
Long way for it to come and turn out to be broken.
Yes,
It's sad.
It is. It's very upsetting.
There are many human faces to Vietnam's health problems. Broken arms that are set using wooden splints instead of plaster. The critically ill in wards that look like dungeons. And at the very beginning of a life, conditions that caused a veteran of 5,000 births to shake his head in wonderment.
After you saw the woman on the labour table, I went to the scrub room, which is just a concrete little patch with a cold water tap running on the floor. The doctor took off her rubber gloves, washed them under the tap, hung them on a piece of string to dry, washed her hands under the tap and walked away. Oh, the chances of introducing infection into the uterus, especially later in labour, is very high. The level of sterility in your home would be higher than the level of sterility in this hospital.
There was one man in particular who was dying to meet the Kiwis the day they came back. He had a present for Dennis Montgomery.
This plaque was the plaque that was presented to the people of Vietnam when the Walter Nash Ward was built, and it was fastened to the building. But in '75, in the evacuation, the new lot in chiselled it off the wall and hurled it into the scrap, probably to be melted down. This man found it straight away and hid it, and it's been produced today. It's excellent. I only hope it goes back up on the wall now. I think it will.
For Dr. Ian Campbell, GP from Wellington, this trip has planted in his heart a steely determination. You going back determined to do some more?
Yes, of course. It's the best thing that I could possibly do for the rest of my time.
Vietnam is full of stories about people coping against the odds. Behind this gate on our last day in Quy Nhon with the Kiwi team, we found one such story. This is the town's leprosarium, dealing as best it can with a scourge that still fills 20 such institutions throughout the country. Here among the medieval images is an amazing man, the hospital superintendent, paid $5 New Zealand dollars a week to do a job which keeps him so busy he can only see his family in a faraway town for 1 week in every year. For the other 51 weeks of the year, this is the doctor's family.
Cái diêm đâu? Không có đánh diêm được không?
As the old saying goes in Vietnam, we've never been short of heroes. For places like Quy Nhon to struggle out of their poverty, there need to be some major changes on the international stage. The US-imposed embargo on trade or aid for Vietnam has helped to keep this country in grinding poverty without the means to grow or adequately care for its sick. Now there are signs of a thaw in the Asian Cold War, and better times may be ahead for these people. A bunch of New Zealanders have proved you don't have to wait for governments to act. Ordinary people can start the process of compassion and aid. The people of Vietnam are among the world's most adept survivors. Isolated economically and diplomatically by the Americans and others for more than a decade and a half since the war, Vietnam knows its revolution needs to be flexible. A couple of years ago, the government decreed that not all farms had to be state collectives. Within 9 months, Vietnam went from near famine to being an exporter of rice, the world's third largest exporter in 1989. But with 20% unemployment in the towns, and the Russians now leaning hard for repayments on a $25 billion debt, Vietnam needs to sell more than rice. It needs to sell the Western world on the idea of burying the past.
Since the Americans are the one which call the shots, I think that once the American agrees to take us back in the fold, I think the whole atmosphere would change.
Nguyen Xuan Van is a real survivor. Believe it or not, this head of Vietnam's investment corporation, who's also a leading politician in the communist government, was once the acting prime minister in the old South Vietnamese regime. He says it's time for Uncle Sam to lighten up.
I think there has been some inconsistencies in the foreign policy of the United States vis-à-vis Vietnam. I somehow have the funny feeling that the United States is still at war with Vietnam at the moment.
The Americans realized in the early 70s that they were on a losing streak in Vietnam. They handed control of the war back to the South Vietnamese regime in 1973 and watched as the battle-hardened tenacity of the Viet Cong took the forces of the North on to victory. Left behind in the rubble, the expenditure of $350 billion and 58,000 American lives, not to mention the lives of more than 1 million Vietnamese. It was a conflict of many enduring images. Among the images of finality in April 1975 were those helicopters, like beaten birds of prey, ferrying the last Americans and a few Vietnamese friends out of Saigon as the forces of the North closed in.
The departure of the last helicopter from the embassy roof represented in one sense the last page of the final chapter of the Vietnam story for America. But as the Viet Cong stormed through the gates of the embassy compound a few hours later, a new saga began. It would be a story of American recrimination over the cost of the war, over the political and military lies that had been told, and over the way the country had treated the homecoming GIs. The real losers in this new story, as in the old, would be the people of Vietnam.
Sanctions don't always work, but in the case of Vietnam, they've been very effective. The Americans, hanging most of their excuses on issues like finding dead and living GIs who might still just be tucked away in the jungle, have prohibited US companies from dealing with the Vietnamese. Japan, Korea and Singapore are happy enough to send TV sets and soft drink into Vietnam, but their fear of American displeasure has choked off any meaningful investment or aid. In recent weeks, signs of change as the Americans came face to face with an embarrassing reality in Southeast Asia. US support for a coalition of rebel forces in Cambodia was channeling arms and aid to the murderous Khmer Rouge. These disciples of Pol Pot turned the country into the killing fields after winning power in 1975. At least 1 million died. Vietnamese forces overthrew the Khmer Rouge in 1979, and using rather circuitous logic, America and many other nations said that was more reason to punish Vietnam. Now the Vietnamese have pulled out, leaving their man in Phnom Penh, and the US has come to the grudging conclusion that even if they don't like that arrangement, the prospect of Pol Pot's men being back in charge is the greater of two evils.
It is a decision simply to begin a dialogue with Vietnam about Cambodia.
The question is, does James Baker's talk of opening a dialogue with the Vietnamese signal a meaningful thaw in relations between the two nations?
I'm encouraged by them. I've sensed from the beginning that Bush was allowing Baker to be less ideologically driven than Reagan will let Schultz be in a number of fronts.
Former Foreign Affairs Minister Russell Marshall has been urging a better deal for the Vietnamese for several years. America, he says, needs to go much further.
The key to it still is, firstly, I think the Americans need to agree to let the international investment community, the World Bank and the IMF, treat Vietnam more seriously and fairly. But until the tick is given, in a sense, by Tokyo and Washington, that will be slowed down. And I think it's a tragedy, and I think it's perverse.
There's an old admonition that goes, he who would have friends must show himself friendly. Since the early 80s, the Vietnamese government has been edging towards what passes for openness in a more than moderately paranoid communist country. There are foreigners on the streets and in the hotels, foreign goods and some spending power in the marketplace. And even a bold theme for 1990, the year of the tourist.
The trouble is, Vietnam's leaders hadn't reckoned on the turmoil in Eastern Europe. As the communist regimes there began to topple in a kind of domino principle in reverse, the government here got a dose of the frights. Suddenly, Vietnam's glasnost was on hold. Several suspicious foreigners were in jail, and a country which had been trying to paint itself as open and enlightened suddenly found itself swamped in a paralysing mistrust of strangers.
The government has been telling the people virtually every week this year, Vietnam is not Poland, it's not Romania, and it's not East Germany. So don't try anything, and be on your guard against reactionary elements. The problem is that level of xenophobia has a price. Hotels built for the year of the tourist stay empty. This resort at a glorious spot 300 kilometres north of Saigon hasn't had a guest for a month. Construction of the West Wing has been halted. The few tourists who could be spending their dollars all over Vietnam face mind-numbing delays getting travel permits.
We feel so much sorry about it, but the security of the country has to be protected. So some people tend to go a little bit heavier on this line. But I think these are isolated incidents. I would say that the government has to be more open in the future and go more into political as well as economic reform. These should go hand in hand, I think.
Wan and his colleagues are trying to send a signal which they say transcends the present skittishness about subversion of the revolution. That signal is, bring in your investment dollars and see what we have to offer. The Australians have already discovered the possibilities. They're spending up large on joint ventures with the Vietnamese, like this Saigon plant which makes insulation panels for cool stores. The South China Sea yields a rich harvest, and the Australians have found the Vietnamese government a willing partner in fish processing. The Aussies have gone big on telecommunications investment here too. So what about New Zealand? Our soldiers fought in Vietnam in a cause now regarded as largely unjust. And after we pulled out, the Kirk Labor government voted $10 million worth of aid for the Vietnamese. We lived up to less than a third of that commitment. Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in late 1978 gave the Muldoon administration all the excuse it needed to choke off an aid program which had by that stage slowed to a trickle. Aid has now resumed from New Zealand in a limited way, and there seems no good reason why we shouldn't be doing more to help. From a purely moral or ideological point of view, would you put it as bluntly to say as we owe them?
I think we owe them, but you know, if that argument doesn't work with a lot of New Zealanders, we can put that to one side. I mean, that's part of my argument, but I think it's also commercially stupid not to be involved there, and I think it's politically stupid because I sense that over the next 50 years or so, we're going to see ourselves as much more a Pacific country, and we must bid to be a legitimate, strong, knowledgeable part of the Pacific Rim community. Now, to stay out of this issue because Uncle Sam or somebody else has a reactionary attitude towards it, I just don't think it's good enough.
Those who do take the plunge, like the Park Royal chain, which has brought a $200 million floating hotel from Queensland to the Saigon River, realise fairly smartly it's going to be a long haul, with occupancy rates painfully low at the outset. The food and beverage manager is New Zealander Rodney Hawker.
I think there's a lot of potential here. I think it'll take a lot longer than what we thought. We thought we were going to come in here and things would probably happen reasonably quickly. Not so. It'll take, I believe, probably 5 to 7 years before it's going to fire.
Do you believe that with the right amount of spade work we can do here what we did in Japan as a nation? I'm talking about New Zealand.
No question. No question at all.
Vietnam, described by The Economist recently as galloping towards destruction, is a country that clearly needs new friends. The economy here has been artificially bolstered for 15 years by Russian rubles, but Moscow has signalled it's got enough on its plate domestically now, and the days of subsidised fuel, cotton, steel and fertiliser are rapidly coming to an end. The Hanoi government is extolling the virtues of its country's resources and cheap labour. And some politicians here say that properly targeted investment could turn Vietnam into another South Korea or Taiwan by the 21st century. Such is the flexibility of the revolution. Question is, have we in New Zealand allowed the wounds the war inflicted on our society to heal sufficiently for us to be as pragmatic as Russell Marshall says we ought to be? There's a little corner of the Saigon War Museum, which, to sort of coin a phrase, will be forever New Zealand. It's to be found among some gruesome reminders of the cost of the Vietnam War. There, lined up alongside the photos of the 5 American presidents whose administrations masterminded the conflict, is former New Zealand Prime Minister Keith Holyoake, shaking hands with Ferdinand Marcos in the mid-1960s. Shaking hands on the principle of keeping Kiwis fighting with Filipinos, Americans, Australians and South Koreans against the North Vietnamese. Thing is, although the West's folly is now recorded here for all time, we're dealing, in 1990, with a new generation of Vietnamese that wants to forget we were ever here as enemies.
As far as the relations between two countries in the past is concerned, we had not so good relations during the wartime. But we think that past is past. Let bygone be bygone. Now we just look forward to the future, and now you can understand our attitude, now the attitude of the government towards New Zealand.
Almost a third of Vietnam's present population of 65 million has been born since the end of the war. Handed on to this new generation is a saying they used to shout at one another over the noise of the bombs. The human being is evergreen. Given the chances that one more generation of peace will bring, that evergreen spirit seems capable of almost anything.